Hello, everyone, and welcome to AP US History for Winners with your teacher, Mr. Johnson. Last time we talked about LBJ's plan for the Great Society, and today we are talking about the African American Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. So if you are ready, let's begin. First, I want to introduce you to a couple of influential civil rights leaders, Martin Luther King, and Malcolm X. And Martin Luther King believes in the idea of nonviolence and civil disobedience. And that idea of nonviolence is very important to understand, so highlight that one. And essentially, the thought is that people should be protesting for their civil rights in a nonviolent way. And even if they are met with violence, they should not use violence back. Okay, so MLK has this idea that African Americans could be American and African, that those ideas could be combined. Okay, and his major goals are to desegregate the United States and to achieve equal rights, famous for ideas like love thy enemy. All right. However, he is assassinated in April of 1968, which sparks widespread outrage over the death of the civil rights leader, Martin Luther King. Another important civil rights leader to be aware of is Malcolm X. He has a very interesting story. He was a member of the Nation of Islam, and especially in his earlier years, was much more extreme than Martin Luther King. He advocated for Black revolution and Black separatism, and this appealed especially to frustrated African Americans. And this means the idea that he did not think in his early years that Blacks and whites should be living in an integrated society, that Blacks and whites should be separate from each other. Okay, and in the middle of his life, in the middle of his kind of tenure as a civil rights leader, he actually he leaves the Nation of Islam. He goes to Africa on a pilgrimage. He converts to something called, I believe, a Sunni Muslim. So it's another version of being Islamic, and he rescinds a lot of his ideas about separatism and this idea of achieving civil rights by any means necessary. And he's actually assassinated in 1965 by members of his old group, the Nation of Islam. Okay, so that is an interesting story and kind of a change of heart that he had, and the result of that for him. But what I do want you to realize, especially from Malcolm X's earlier years in his push for civil rights compared to Martin Luther King, that these leaders disagreed about the ways to achieve equality. And that is a core concept that we need to understand, that not everybody was sure about the best way forward. All right, so let's talk about a few protests and how the civil rights activists worked to achieve their goals. We've talked about this sit-in before, but I want to bring it up again because it's important. So this is the Greensboro, North Carolina sit-in, and it takes place in February 1st of 1960 is when it gets started. And so it gets started with 4 Black students that sit at a segregated lunch counter at Woolworth's 5 and Dime store. And as the week progressed, more and more students join in on this sit-in. And again, a sit-in is just where you sit in the lunch counter where Blacks were not allowed to be. And it's a nonviolent protest, okay? And this inspired sit-ins across the country. And this is a very important concept to know, so highlight this. And this is the idea that the success of this, the attention that it got, inspired more people to want to come together to try to stop racial discrimination. And that's an important idea. Another protest is called the Freedom Rides, and that's created by this group called CORE, which stands for the Congress of Racial Equality. And the Freedom Riders are a group of people who wanted to challenge the segregation on interstate buses in the South, so buses that went from state to state. And they wanted to force the Justice Department to enforce desegregation laws, because what had happened was in 1960, the Supreme Court had said that interstate buses had to be desegregated. Interstate buses had to be integrated, but the South was not listening. Okay. And then there's an event in Birmingham, Alabama, where the Freedom Riders were attacked by a white mob, and they set the bus on fire. And you can see that pictured here on the left. It is a very traumatic event. And eventually, the attention that this gets in September of 1961, the Freedom Riders get the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC, to actually enforce the ban on segregation. All right. Continuing on with some more ideas about civil rights protests and what they, their impact. There's a man named James Meredith, and he was registered at the University of Mississippi, which was not an integrated school at the time. And 500 federal marshals were attacked by a mob when Meredith tried to enroll in the school. And so James Meredith wants to enroll in an all-white school because it's supposed to be segregated, but people aren't willing to let that happen. The federal marshals get attacked when they try to escort him to school. And so the president at the time, Kennedy, JFK, has to order 30,000 troops to go to the area to restore order. So that's one event. Martin Luther King is focused in Birmingham, Alabama, and a lot of him and a lot of other of his followers were arrested for protesting. And there's this very famous letter that we should be aware of called the Letter from a Birmingham Jail. And that's, a picture of his mugshot in the top left from when he was arrested for his protest, for his nonviolent protest. And this letter from the Birmingham Jail draws on Henry David Thoreau's, which we've learned about him before, and Gandhi's ideas of civil disobedience. And civil disobedience is the concept that if you believe a law is unjust, you should not follow it. And that is what Martin Luther King was trying to do and try to encourage other people to do. Now, these protests were met often with resistance from white Southerners. And one example of that is Eugene Bull Connor. You can see him pictured here on the bottom left, and he was a Southern politician. And he would use fire hoses to break up protests. He would have dogs sent on protesters. Okay, so it's not as if the nonviolence was met with nonviolence. Often the people protesting in nonviolent ways were met with violent attacks. Okay, and these attacks, because of television, were broadcasted on the news, and this helps spread the awareness of the issues that are happening. All right, continuing on with our story, we're going to talk a little about something going on in Alabama and then a very famous event, the March on Washington. So the governor of Alabama, George Wallace at the time, he vows to avoid desegregation at the University of Alabama. So George Wallace does not want the University of Alabama to integrate, and 2 black students register to go, and George Wallace gives a famous speech where he basically says, we're not going to integrate the school. Okay. Now at this moment, JFK, who's the president, John Kennedy, he realizes that he no longer can negotiate with the South on the issue of civil rights. Kennedy realizes that he needs to start presenting the civil rights issue as a moral one, and he's going to ask Congress to pass laws that support voting rights in order to get people in power that will support civil rights legislation. We'll talk about some of those laws on the next slide. But before that, a very important event that we should know of, we should be able to name, the March on Washington, which I'm sure you've heard of before. It is pictured here on the left. It is August 28th, 1963. It is the largest civil rights protest in U.S. history. There's over 200,000 plus people that are marching in Washington, D.C. for civil rights. And this is where MLK gives his famous I Have a Dream speech at the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. And hopefully you can see the symbolism there between Lincoln and what MLK was asking almost 100 years later for people to do. All right. So these are those laws that we've talked about, these laws before, but they're so important. That's why we're bringing them up again and again and again. So make sure we know that these laws, make sure we can name these laws. All right. And these are the things that JFK and later LBJ is going to get to pass. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it is passed because of the protests that happened. That is an important understanding to have, that these laws get passed because people are protesting and they're making the government do something about it. They're not waiting around for it to happen. Okay. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964 guarantees equal access to public accommodations. It creates the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to ensure that these rules are being followed. And it basically, in order to have some teeth to this law, it says that the government could cut off funds if discrimination occurred in that state. And obviously the states need the government's funds. So this is a way for the government to make sure states are following their laws. And then there's the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which we've talked about before as well. This says that the federal government could register voters. It eliminates literacy tests for voting. And this has the result of the number of African Americans being registered to vote, especially in the South, is skyrocketing, going up dramatically. And then there's a couple of vocab words I want us to be familiar with at the bottom here: de jure discrimination and de facto discrimination. And these are different ways that people can face discrimination. And de jure discrimination is when people are discriminated due to actual laws that are in place. Okay, so jure, jury, right? You can kind of see the root of that word. That means there are laws in place that are discriminated against people. And then de facto discrimination is when people are discriminated against because of customs or traditions that are in a society as opposed to laws. And at this time, they're working to overcome de jure discrimination, but de facto discrimination is almost harder to even overcome, because to change people's minds and custom traditions is harder than just passing a law. Now, moving on, there's a couple important organizations that we should be aware of that are going to advance the cause of civil rights. One of them is called the SNCC. Important to know this one, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And what they do is they help register African Americans to vote in Mississippi. Only 5% of African Americans were registered to vote before they kind of get involved in 1964. And they're also responsible for a number of nonviolent protests like the sit-ins that we've been talking about. Another important group is the Black Panthers, which are a famous group from 1966 is where they get started, but then they kind of go on from there. And they're led by a couple of people, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. They're the founders of the Black Panthers. And they're a different kind of organization. Instead of nonviolence, they actually advocate for the arming of Black people to fight back against white police and the violence that Black people are facing. Okay, so not everyone, again, agrees on the way that civil rights should happen or the way people should protest to get civil rights. The last idea I want us to understand is this concept of white resistance. And white resistance is going to slow the efforts of desegregation. And that's an important concept to know. We've talked about it before, and I'll give you some evidence for that now. So there is this idea called a massive resistance. And this is an idea promoted by a Virginia senator. And the thought is that Southern schools should shut down before they desegregate. So if the law from Brown v. Board of Ed says that they have to integrate their schools, well, they should just shut the schools down. That's how far some people were willing to go. Another piece of evidence here, if you needed to back this up, would be the Southern Manifesto. And that's a group of 101 congressmen at the time that believed that the Supreme Court had overstepped its power when they issued Brown v. Board of Ed. And they thought that that was an overreach. And so these congressmen were trying to get the government to stop pushing for civil rights so much. And last, the famous story of the Little Rock Nine, which are 9 students that are trying to integrate a school. And when this is supposed to happen, the governor, Orville Faubus, you don't need to know the name, but he refuses to integrate the schools. And the president, at the time is President Eisenhower, he had to send troops down to make the school be integrated. So again, I want you to see that the South is slow to enact change, even if the change is already a law. The South is slow to do that. And these are some examples of that happening. And I just want you to know that there's this overall sentiment that civil rights activists were either wrong, that people should not be getting the civil rights, or even on the thought that civil rights activists should just be patient and that they shouldn't be demanding their equality so quickly. And that's a concept that's going around, or a thought process kind of going around at the time. Okay, so that is it for our notes on the African American civil rights movement from the 1960s. Let's go over our big ideas, make sure we understand them and can synthesize this information. So number 1, describe the strategies used by civil rights leaders. Be specific about a strategy. Number 2, describe one specific law and name that law that can help achieve equality. And number 3, describe the Southern reaction to the civil rights movement. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.